It was an ordinary morning at Los Angeles International Airport where Ethan Carter, a software developer in his early 30s, walked alongside his wife Emily and their 7-year-old daughter Sophie. The excitement in the air was palpable as they made their way through the terminal, heading for their gate. After years of planning, they were finally going to visit Ethan's family in the Philippines. The trip was important, not only because it had been a long time since he last saw his mother, but also because Sophie was going to meet her grandmother for the first time. "Are you excited, sweetheart?" Ethan asked, glancing down at Sophie as she skipped along beside him, her small backpack bouncing with each step. "I can't wait to see Grandma," Sophie beamed, her face lighting up with the thought of the trip. Ethan smiled, adjusting the strap of his own backpack. Emily, carrying their passports and tickets, walked beside him, her gaze shifting from Sophie to Ethan, checking that everything was in order. The family was finally going to reunite after years apart, and Ethan couldn't help but feel nervous in the best way. He hadn't seen his mother in over 5 years, and this trip felt like it was full of possibility. At the check-in counter, everything seemed to go smoothly. The airline worker greeted them warmly, accepted their passports, and handed them their boarding passes. As they moved toward the security checkpoint, Ethan began to notice a police officer standing near the scanners. He stood still, watching the flow of passengers, but as soon as Ethan passed by, the officer's gaze lingered on him. Ethan immediately dismissed the thought. Maybe the officer was just doing his job. "Stay close, Sophie," Ethan said to his daughter, trying to ease his nerves. But as they approached the security line, Ethan felt something strange. He could feel the officer's gaze fixed on him, even as they moved further away. He glanced back, and sure enough, Officer Jacobs was still watching. Ethan felt a twinge of unease, but he forced a smile, focusing on Sophie and Emily as they passed through the scanner. Ethan placed his backpack in a bin and removed his shoes. He tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but when they reached the scanner, something unexpected happened. The scanner beeped when he stepped through, and the TSA agent frowned. "Sir, please step to the side," the agent instructed, gesturing toward a secondary area. Confused, Ethan stepped aside. "I don't have anything on me," he explained. But the agent remained silent, signaling for a second officer to approach. Emily's face twisted in concern, but Ethan gave her a small nod. "I'll be fine, just a routine check," Ethan said, trying to reassure his wife. The second agent patted him down, running a metal detector over his body. He looked at Ethan, raised an eyebrow, and waved him through. "You're clear, sir." Ethan exhaled in relief, but just as he reached for his backpack, a hand landed firmly on his shoulder. "Sir, I need you to come with me," Officer Jacobs said, his tone harsh. Ethan froze. "What's going on?" he asked, his heart racing. "You've been acting suspicious," Officer Jacobs replied, his grip tightening on Ethan's arm. "You hesitated in line, and the scanner beeped again. We need to talk." Ethan's stomach churned. "I didn't do anything. Your agents just cleared me," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Ma'am, please step back," Officer Jacobs barked when Emily stepped forward, looking increasingly panicked. "No, let him go," Emily protested, her voice shaking. "He hasn't done anything wrong." People in the line behind them began whispering, some even pulling out their phones to record the scene. Ethan could feel the heat of their gazes on him. His heart pounded as his mind raced. What was happening? Why was he being treated like this? Ethan kept his composure, speaking firmly. "I'm not a criminal. I'm here with my wife and daughter. We're just trying to get to our flight." "Turn around," Officer Jacobs ordered sharply. Before Ethan could react, Jacobs shoved him hard. His chest slammed against the cold, hard floor, and his breath was knocked out of him. A knee pressed into his back, pinning him down. He struggled to breathe, gasping as his body tensed in pain. His mind was reeling from the sudden attack. "Daddy!" Sophie's voice screamed, and Ethan's heart broke. Emily's frantic cries rang out, but Ethan could barely hear her over the ringing in his ears. His arms were pinned beneath him, and the weight on his back made it nearly impossible to catch a breath. The situation was getting out of control, and Ethan didn't know what to do. Another officer ran over, looking concerned. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes scanning the scene. "This guy tried to run past security," Officer Jacobs grumbled. "I had to take him down. He's probably smuggling something." "But he's not resisting," the second officer said, looking perplexed. "He's not fighting back. Why would you take him down like this?" Ethan's bag lay sprawled on the floor beside him. Clothes, a book, and a small box with a drawing of a little girl on it were scattered around. A piercing voice interrupted the chaos. "Daddy." The officer's grip loosened for a moment as Officer Jacobs looked over at Sophie, who was running toward her father, her face filled with fear and confusion. Emily chased after her, but it was too late. Officer Jacobs froze as his eyes locked with the child, then back to Ethan. His face drained of color. For a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. The weight on Ethan's back lifted slightly, and the tension in the room shifted. "Let him go," the second officer ordered, stepping in. The officer hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting between the little girl and Ethan. Slowly, he removed his knee from Ethan's back and stepped away. Ethan gasped for air as he rolled onto his side. His chest ached, and his wrists burned from where they had been twisted. Emily was immediately by his side, her hands gently touching his face, her voice trembling. "Ethan, are you okay?" Ethan nodded weakly, though the pain in his chest and the shock of the situation left him speechless. He tried to stand, his legs shaking, but he managed to stay upright with Emily's help. Sophie, clinging to her mother's side, looked up at Ethan with wide, tear-filled eyes. Officer Jacobs stood a few steps away, watching the family with a mix of guilt and suspicion, but said nothing. "Let's get this sorted out," the second officer said, his voice calm. "Let's take this somewhere private." Ethan wanted nothing more than to leave and get back to his family, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. He had no idea why he had been singled out, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Ethan's hands were still shaking as he was escorted to a small private room. The second officer, who had intervened earlier, led the way. Ethan didn't know what to expect next, but the tension in the air was thick. His chest still ached from the pressure, and his mind raced with confusion. The only thing keeping him grounded was Emily's presence beside him, her hand tightly gripping his arm. Sophie, still clutching her mother's side, was quiet, her face pale and confused. "Are you okay, Daddy?" Sophie finally whispered, looking up at Ethan. Ethan forced a smile, trying to reassure her despite the heavy knot in his stomach. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Don't worry." They reached the door of the small room, and the officer opened it, gesturing for them to enter. Ethan hesitated for a moment, still trying to process everything that had happened. The door clicked shut behind them as they stepped into the sterile, brightly lit room. There was a long table with a few chairs, but no windows. It felt like a holding room, one that didn't belong to someone like Ethan, who was just a father trying to get on a flight with his family. "Please, have a seat," the officer said, pointing to the chairs. Ethan sat down heavily, his body sore from being forced to the ground. Emily sat next to him, her eyes still wide with worry. Sophie remained standing, her hand clutching her mother's shirt, looking between the officers with a mixture of confusion and fear. A few minutes passed in silence before the door opened again. This time, A man in a dark suit entered, his posture straight and professional. He had the air of someone in charge, someone who expected respect. He looked briefly at Ethan and Emily before sitting down at the table across from them. "Good afternoon," the man said, his voice calm, but his eyes were sharp, observant. "I'm Robert Calloway. I oversee security operations here at LAX." Ethan raised an eyebrow, still trying to process everything. "Oversee security operations? Then why was my family treated like this?" Calloway gave him a brief nod, his expression unreadable. "I'm aware of the situation, and I want to personally apologize for what happened back there." Ethan's anger flared at his words. "An apology?" he said, his voice tight with frustration. "Do you have any idea what you just put me and my family through?" "I understand your frustration," Calloway said smoothly. "But let's take a step back. The truth is, your name came up in our system flagged under suspicious activity. It's a routine protocol, and it led to this unfortunate situation." Ethan's stomach twisted at the mention of his name being flagged. "Suspicious activity?" he repeated, his voice rising. "What are you talking about? I've never been involved in anything illegal." Calloway leaned back in his chair. "I'm aware of that. But your name appeared in connection with an ongoing investigation, and based on the security protocols we follow, we were obligated to investigate further." Emily's eyes narrowed. "You're telling me you singled out my husband just because his name was flagged?" "Essentially, yes," Calloway replied, his tone still calm, but now tinged with regret. "But I assure you, Mr. Carter, this wasn't personal. It was just a precautionary measure." A bitter laugh escaped Ethan's lips. "Precautionary? You shoved me to the ground in front of my daughter. That's not a precaution. That's an overreaction." Calloway's eyes flickered for a brief moment, and then he sighed. "I understand, but it's not as simple as that. We have to follow procedures. When something raises red flags, we investigate." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He knew something didn't add up, but he couldn't put his finger on it yet. "You're telling me I've been profiled?" Calloway looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "Yes, your name was flagged, and I can only assume it's related to your background. You're in the software industry, correct?" Ethan's brows furrowed. "Yeah, I work in IT. What does that have to do with anything?" "It's relevant," Calloway said, leaning forward. "There are certain profiles that are system targets. Your profession, combined with your name showing up in the database, made you a person of interest." Ethan's blood ran cold. "So, because of my job, you assumed I was some kind of criminal?" "It's not that simple," Calloway replied, though his tone was apologetic. "But yes, certain characteristics in our system may cause people to be flagged. It's part of a larger investigation." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to process what he was hearing. "And you couldn't have just asked me about this before you threw me on the ground like that?" Calloway hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "That was an error in judgment. I'm not proud of how it was handled, but we were simply following protocols." Emily had remained silent until now, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "So, this is just a mistake? You've ruined our trip over a mistake?" Calloway didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Ethan and Emily for a long time, as if weighing his words carefully. "I can't undo what happened, but I want to assure you that it won't happen again." Ethan clenched his fists. "You can't fix what happened to me, my wife, or my daughter. But you can at least tell me what's going on." "I will," Calloway said, "but I can't give you all the details. All I can tell you is that your name appeared in connection with a smuggling operation under investigation." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "A smuggling operation?" Calloway nodded. We don't have all the details yet, but we're working to understand why your name is showing up in our system. Ethan's mind raced. So, you think I'm involved in some kind of criminal activity? No, Calloway said quickly. I'm just saying your name came up. It's part of an ongoing investigation. But I can assure you, Mr. Carter, that you're not the target. The system made an error. Ethan's head was spinning. Everything about this felt wrong, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut that this was just the beginning. Ethan sat back in his chair, trying to steady his breath. The words that Robert Calloway had just spoken didn't sit right with him. His name flagged in connection to a smuggling operation? There had to be a mistake. He wasn't involved in anything illegal. His job in IT had never led to any criminal activity, and yet, somehow, here he was, stuck in this nightmare, being treated like a suspect. Emily's hand was still on his, but her grip had loosened slightly, her fingers tapping restlessly on the table. Sophie, having stayed quiet since they entered the room, now clutched her stuffed bear close to her chest, still processing the chaos around her. Calloway must have noticed the weight of the silence because he spoke again, his voice steady. Look, Mr. Carter, I understand this is a lot to digest. I assure you, your involvement in this operation is not clear. Our investigation into the smuggling ring is ongoing, and we're still piecing things together. But your name was flagged, and that's why we had to investigate. Ethan nodded slowly, but remained unconvinced. I'm still not buying it. I've never been involved in anything like that, and I certainly haven't been in touch with anyone who would get me mixed up in it. I believe you, Calloway replied, his eyes meeting Ethan's for the first time with a hint of sincerity. But the system doesn't care about beliefs. It flags names based on certain criteria, and in your case, it flagged yours. So, you profile people based on their job or their background? You don't even check if they're actually involved in anything? Ethan's voice was rising now, frustration seeping through his words. Calloway sighed and leaned forward slightly, his tone calming. It's not that simple, but yes, certain profiles do get flagged, and that's why we investigate further. But in your case, Ethan, I think it was a mistake. I'm not convinced you're involved, but we have to follow protocol. Protocol, Emily muttered bitterly. That's what this is all about, right? Following protocol while you ruin people's lives? Calloway didn't argue. Instead, he glanced at Sophie, who was now holding her bear a little tighter, and then back at Ethan. I understand your anger, and I'll take full responsibility for the way things were handled earlier. But my hands are tied. I can't change the system, and I can't undo what happened. But I can tell you this. The person who flagged your name has likely made a huge mistake. If you cooperate, we can get this resolved quickly. Ethan's thoughts were racing. Who had flagged his name? Why? He had no idea. There was something unsettling about the entire situation, the way everything had escalated so quickly, the strange focus on him, the sudden involvement in something far bigger than he could understand. What happens now? Ethan asked, his voice low but firm. I'm going to recommend that we suspend your profile in the system, Calloway said, his voice steady. But I can't promise it will be cleared immediately. You're free to go for now, but I suggest you remain available for any follow-up questions. The investigation into the smuggling operation is ongoing, and we may need to contact you again. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure how he felt about that. There were still too many unanswered questions. So, that's it? I'm free to go, but I might be called back in? Calloway hesitated for a moment before answering. That's right. But I wouldn't leave the country anytime soon. If your name's been flagged, it's likely that someone is watching you. Ethan's stomach twisted at the thought. Someone was watching him? He had only just learned about the flag in the system, and now it felt like everything had spiraled out of control. Emily noticed his expression change and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Let's just go home, Ethan," she said softly, her voice laced with exhaustion. "We'll figure this out. But we need to get out of here." Ethan glanced at her and nodded, though his mind wasn't entirely present. He wanted nothing more than to get on that plane and put this whole mess behind them. But something inside him told him this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Sophie looked up at Ethan, her eyes wide with concern. "Daddy, what's wrong?" she asked, her small voice barely above a whisper. Ethan smiled at her, trying to mask his unease. "It's nothing, sweetheart. We're just fine now. Let's get on our plane and go see Grandma, okay?" Sophie's face lit up again, and Emily sighed in relief. "Yeah, we're getting on that plane. I just want to forget this entire thing." Calloway stood up and adjusted his jacket. "I'll walk you out. Just please remember, Mr. Carter, stay available for further questions. And keep in mind that the investigation may not be over." Ethan stood up slowly, rubbing his sore wrists. "Thanks, but I really need to get out of here. I've had enough of your investigation for today." As they walked back through the terminal, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Calloway had been polite, but there was something off about the whole encounter. He had mentioned that Ethan's name was flagged because of some broader investigation into a smuggling ring. But why had his name come up? Why wasn't there more information available to prove his innocence? "Do you think this is over?" Emily asked quietly as they neared the gate. "I don't know," Ethan replied, his voice tight. "I don't feel like it is." "Then we'll handle it together," Emily said, her tone resolute. "We've been through worse." Ethan wanted to believe her. He wanted to forget about all this and focus on the trip. But in the back of his mind, something told him that the real trouble was only just beginning. As they walked toward the boarding gate, Ethan kept glancing around, as if expecting someone to jump out at him from the crowd. But no one did. The airport buzzed with the normal chaos of passengers rushing to their gates, oblivious to the events that had just transpired. And yet, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching. The gate was crowded with people, all eager to board their flights, but Ethan felt a deep unease settle in his chest. The airport, once full of excitement, now seemed heavy with tension. He glanced at Emily, who was still holding Sophie close, trying to offer her comfort despite her own worries. Ethan couldn't help but replay the conversation with Calloway in his mind. The promise of a quick resolution felt hollow, and something in his gut told him that this was far from over. As they approached the boarding desk, Sophie tugged at Ethan's sleeve. "Daddy, can we sit by the window?" Ethan smiled softly and nodded. "Sure, sweetheart. We'll sit by the window when we get on the plane." They handed their boarding passes to the gate agent, who smiled politely before directing them toward the jet bridge. Ethan took one last look at the terminal, feeling like something was out of place, but shook the thought away. He was just overthinking. The anxiety from earlier was getting to him. Once they were on the plane, Ethan settled into his seat, adjusting his bag under the seat in front of him. Sophie sat next to Emily, her head resting against her mother's shoulder, already growing sleepy. Ethan exhaled, trying to relax. This was supposed to be the calm part of their journey, the flight. He was desperate to leave everything behind and start fresh in the Philippines. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they would be taking off shortly. Ethan fastened his seatbelt and settled in, glancing out the window as the plane began to taxi toward the runway. As the plane lifted off, Emily looked over at Ethan, her face still marked by the strain of the events earlier. She leaned in close, her voice soft. "Are you okay?" Ethan nodded, though his mind was still racing. "I'll be fine once we're in the air and on our way to Manila. This has been a nightmare." Emily didn't say anything for a moment, then squeezed his hand. "I know, but we're together. That's what matters." Ethan smiled faintly, grateful for her support. But no matter how much he wanted to let go of the tension, a nagging feeling kept him on edge. The thought that someone might be watching them still lingered, hovering like a dark cloud. He tried to push it aside, focusing on Sophie, who was now drifting off to sleep. But then, the peaceful calm of the flight was shattered. A loud bang echoed from the front of the plane. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The passengers around them gasped, and Sophie jolted awake, her eyes wide with fear. Emily wrapped her arms around her tightly, whispering soothing words, but Ethan could see the panic in her eyes. "What was that?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Ethan replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He looked around at the other passengers, who were all starting to murmur and shift nervously in their seats. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, but this time it wasn't the calm, reassuring tone Ethan was used to hearing. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice said, now strained, "we are experiencing a security issue. Please remain calm and stay in your seats." A few moments of silence followed, but then, suddenly, a masked figure appeared at the front of the plane, holding a gun. Panic erupted throughout the cabin. Passengers screamed, some ducking down in their seats, others trying to escape. Ethan instinctively reached for Emily's hand, pulling Sophie closer to him. "Everyone stay in your seats," the hijacker shouted, his voice muffled by the mask. "No one move, or I will shoot." Ethan's stomach dropped. He looked around frantically, but the situation had already escalated too quickly. Sophie clung to Emily, her small body trembling with fear. Ethan's pulse was racing, his mind trying to make sense of what was happening. The hijacker's eyes scanned the passengers, and then, to Ethan's horror, they landed on him. The man's lip curled into a sinister grin, and he began to walk down the aisle, his gun aimed at Ethan. "You!" the hijacker sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "We've been waiting for you." Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. He tried to remain calm, but his thoughts were spinning. How did they know it was him? He hadn't even been aware that he was being watched on the plane. The hijacker continued to approach, his eyes never leaving Ethan. "Get up," the hijacker demanded, shoving the barrel of the gun into Ethan's chest. "We're going to need your cooperation." Ethan froze, every muscle in his body locking up. His thoughts raced, but all he could focus on was Emily's terrified face, Sophie's quiet sobs as she pressed her face against her mother's chest. "Please," Emily whispered, her voice shaky. "Don't hurt him. Don't hurt our daughter." Ethan could feel the eyes of the entire plane on him, waiting for him to react. His mind screamed at him to do something, but he didn't know what. He couldn't make a move without risking the lives of everyone on board. The hijacker's grip on the gun tightened, and Ethan knew he had no choice but to comply. At least for now. He stood up slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. "What do you want from me?" Ethan asked, his voice strained. The hijacker's smile widened. "It's simple. You're going to help us crack a system, a very important system, and you'll do it now." Ethan's stomach turned as he realized what the hijacker was talking about. The smuggling operation, his connection to it. This was why his name had been flagged. Mercer, the man who had been behind everything, was now forcing him to help them. But there was no way he could help them, not without putting his family at even greater risk. "Not a chance," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. The hijacker's eyes narrowed, and his grip on the gun tightened. But before anything more could happen, the plane lurched suddenly, throwing everyone forward in their seats. Oxygen masks fell from the overhead compartments, and chaos erupted. Screams filled the cabin as passengers tried to grab the masks, but the hijackers were too focused on Ethan. Something was wrong. The plane was shaking violently, and Ethan could see the worried looks on the faces of the hijackers. The military? Did they know? Then, through the intercom, the captain's voice came again, though it was garbled and faint. "Military! On the way!" Ethan's heart raced. They weren't alone anymore. Help was coming. But would they get there in time? The plane continued to shake violently, and the overhead lights flickered intermittently. The hijackers, now visibly nervous, seemed distracted, exchanging worried glances as the sound of military aircraft grew louder outside. Ethan's pulse was pounding in his ears, but he tried to stay focused. The hijacker standing in front of him, the one who had threatened him earlier, now looked at him with suspicion, clearly uncertain of how the situation was escalating. "Sit down," the hijacker ordered, his eyes darting to the cockpit. "Now!" Ethan slowly lowered himself back into his seat, his mind racing. Sophie, still clinging to Emily, was trembling, her small face buried against her mother's chest. Ethan could barely bring himself to comfort her. He was too focused on trying to figure out how to survive this nightmare. As he sat there, hands clenched into fists, his mind flashed back to the conversation with Calloway. He'd been told his name was flagged in connection to a smuggling ring under investigation. And now, here he was, stuck in the middle of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. It all pointed to one person, Daniel Mercer, the man who had once been a business contact of Ethan's years ago. Ethan's stomach twisted. He had never suspected Mercer of being involved in anything illegal, but the past few days had proven just how little he knew. If Mercer was involved in the hijacking, then it was clear his situation had been set up long before this flight. This wasn't a random act of terrorism. It was personal. "Keep your head down," the hijacker said, his voice low, almost too calm. "We've got all we need. You'll do what we say, and no one gets hurt." Ethan nodded but didn't speak. The situation was moving too fast for him to process everything, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let them take control of his family without a fight. He just needed to buy time, figure out what he could do. The plane lurched again, this time harder, and Ethan was thrown forward in his seat. Panic spread through the cabin as people screamed, some of them pressing the emergency buttons, others trying to grab their oxygen masks. The hijacker shouted something into his radio, but the words were garbled by the turbulence. Ethan looked around, searching for any opportunity to act. Then it happened. The cockpit door suddenly swung open, and one of the hijackers, who had been standing near the front, stumbled backward, clutching his head as blood trickled from a gash. His gun clattered to the floor as he staggered, his legs buckling beneath him. The sound of footsteps pounding in the cockpit filled the cabin, followed by the unmistakable screech of the aircraft's engines as the plane suddenly dropped, sending a jolt of fear through Ethan's entire body. The pilot was fighting back. Ethan's hope flared, but it was quickly crushed as the remaining hijackers reacted swiftly, grabbing the injured man and dragging him back into the aisle. The other hijacker, the one who had been holding the gun to Ethan, turned sharply. "Get back in your seat," he barked, aiming the weapon at Ethan. But before Ethan could react, the second hijacker, who had been near the rear of the plane, suddenly rushed forward, his eyes frantic. He leaned down and whispered something into the first hijacker's ear, his words almost lost in the noise. The first hijacker hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing, then looked around the cabin at the other passengers, his gaze lingering on Ethan. "You," the hijacker said, his voice now tinged with a kind of dark amusement. "You look confused, Mr. Carter." Ethan's heart froze at the mention of his name. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, keeping his voice as steady as possible. The hijacker's lips curled into a sneer. "I've been waiting for you," he said, a chilling edge to his voice. "You're not just some random guy on this flight. You've been chosen." Ethan's mind raced. Chosen for what? What the hell was going on? He was just an ordinary guy. He didn't have any involvement in illegal activities. Not really. But now, sitting on this plane, surrounded by hijackers and terrified passengers, he realized he was tangled up in something far bigger than he had ever anticipated. "We need you to do something," the hijacker continued, his grip tightening on the gun. "We've been tracking you for a while, Carter. You've got certain skills we need." Ethan felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "Skills? What are you talking about?" The hijacker didn't answer directly. Instead, he looked toward the cockpit. "We're taking control of this flight, and you're going to help us access the systems." Ethan's stomach twisted. "I won't do it," he said firmly, though his voice shook slightly. "I'm not helping you." The hijacker grinned, but it wasn't a smile of reassurance. "You don't have a choice. You'll do what we say, or we'll start picking people off." Ethan's blood ran cold. The hijacker's words were crystal clear. If he refused to help, they would kill someone. But Ethan didn't want to comply, not without knowing exactly what they were after. There was no way he was going to give them access to anything that could hurt his family or anyone on this plane. Just as he began to consider his options, the intercom crackled to life again, this time not with the captain's voice, but with an unfamiliar one. The voice was calm, but it carried an ominous weight. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your new pilot speaking. We've taken control of this flight, and we are not going down without getting what we need. Stay in your seats. Do not attempt to interfere." The hijacker standing in front of Ethan looked pleased. "See? We don't need you to help us yet. But you will. Eventually." Ethan clenched his fists under the seat in front of him. He didn't know what Mercer had planned, but he had to find a way to stop it. Before it was too late. Ethan's mind was racing. Every second felt like an eternity as he sat in his seat, trying to process what had just happened. The hijackers had made their demands clear, but the words didn't make sense. What did they want from him? Why had they been tracking him? He had never been involved in anything illegal, at least not in any way that would have drawn this kind of attention. Yet here he was, sitting in the middle of a hijacking, being told that he had certain skills they needed. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of movement in the aisle. One of the hijackers, the one who had threatened him earlier, was walking toward the cockpit, his gun still tightly gripped in his hand. The other hijacker remained in the middle of the aisle, keeping an eye on the rest of the passengers who were still huddled in their seats, eyes wide with fear. Ethan's body tensed as he looked at Sophie, who was still curled up in Emily's arms, her face buried in her mother's shoulder. Emily was whispering something to her, trying to comfort her, but it was clear Sophie was scared. Her tiny body trembled with every passing second. Ethan's heart ached as he watched them. He couldn't let these people hurt his family. Not now. Not ever. But what could he do? The hijackers were armed, and they had complete control of the situation. Any wrong move could mean death, for him or for his loved ones. The hijacker in front of him, the one with the gun, finally broke the silence. "We need you to crack into the system," he said, his voice low and insistent. "We know you can do it. You're the only one who can." Ethan swallowed hard. His mind was still reeling from everything that had happened. He had no idea what they were talking about. He worked in IT, sure, but hacking into a plane's systems, or some other system they were referring to, was beyond him. He wasn't some expert in cybersecurity. He was just a regular guy. But if they thought he could help them, they were probably mistaken. But if he refused, Ethan's thoughts stopped there. He couldn't risk their lives to prove a point. He had to buy time. He had to figure out a way to fight back. As the hijacker turned away to join the others near the cockpit, Ethan's mind clicked into overdrive. He had to act, and he had to do it now. Sophie's face, filled with terror, flashed in his mind. He couldn't let her down. Not now. Not when they were so close to freedom. Without thinking, Ethan leaned over to Emily, keeping his voice low. "Get ready," he whispered. Emily looked at him, her eyes wide with confusion, but Ethan could see the same resolve in her eyes that he felt in his chest. She nodded, understanding that something was about to happen. She shifted Sophie slightly, holding her close, but she was ready to act. Ethan's mind was already working on the next step. He had to get the plane's systems under control. The hijackers were focused on the cockpit, but he had to take advantage of the momentary distraction. The only problem was, he had no idea how to hack into a plane's systems. He didn't know the first thing about avionics or how to override the security systems. But then he remembered something. A while ago, when Ethan had worked in software development for a high-end security company, he had briefly worked on encryption systems. He wasn't an expert, but he understood the basics of securing sensitive information. He knew what kind of systems the hijackers would likely be trying to access. If they were trying to gain control of the plane's systems, there was one thing he could do. He could try to jam their access long enough for help to arrive. At least, that was the hope. He kept his breathing steady, trying not to give away his plans to the hijackers standing near him. The man was too distracted, watching the cockpit, the chaos unfolding outside the cabin. The rest of the plane, however, remained eerily silent, the fear hanging in the air like a thick fog. Ethan slowly reached under his seat, pulling out his phone. It wasn't much, but he had a few emergency tools installed on it, just in case he ever needed them. He hadn't used them in years, but now seemed like the perfect time to dust them off. His fingers hovered over the screen as he quickly activated an encryption-breaking tool, trying to scan for any vulnerabilities in the plane's security systems. The hijackers hadn't anticipated this. They had assumed Ethan could just walk them through whatever they needed, but he had other plans. If he could send out a distress signal without them noticing, then maybe, just maybe, he could save his family. His heart raced as the phone buzzed with a signal, the familiar pattern of data flowing through the network. The hijacker near him didn't seem to notice, too focused on the cockpit and the tension building between the remaining hijackers. Ethan's hands were trembling as he input the final command. He pressed a button, and within seconds, a warning alarm went off on the plane, signaling that the aircraft's internal systems had been tampered with. The hijackers turned in surprise, their eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell is going on?" the first hijacker shouted, rushing toward Ethan, his gun raised. Ethan's heart raced, but he didn't have time to worry about the consequences. The moment he triggered the alarm, the plane's internal lockdown systems engaged. The cockpit door locked tightly, sealing off any further access. "Get down!" the hijacker screamed, lunging for Ethan, but the second hijacker was already scrambling to get to the cockpit. Before Ethan could react, he heard the unmistakable sound of military jets roaring through the sky outside, their engines loud and powerful. The military had arrived. The hijackers were distracted, the alarms blaring through the cabin, and Ethan knew they had only seconds left to act. His eyes met Emily's. She was ready. This was their chance. The alarms continued to blare, echoing through the cabin as the hijackers scrambled in confusion. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the panic spread among them. The first hijacker, who had been holding the gun to his chest, turned toward the cockpit door, eyes wide with disbelief. The second hijacker, who had been standing near the rear of the plane, was still shouting into his radio, trying to make sense of the chaos that had suddenly erupted. "Shut it down! Shut the alarms off!" the first hijacker screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the deafening sound of the emergency alarms and the growing roar of military jets outside. Ethan's mind raced. He had done it. He had triggered the lockdown system. The plane's cockpit was sealed off, the emergency communications had been sent, and the military was en route. They were going to be rescued. But it wasn't over yet. The hijackers were still armed, still dangerous, and still in control of the rest of the plane. Ethan's eyes flickered to Emily and Sophie. Sophie was still clutching her stuffed bear, her face pale with fear, but Emily was wide-eyed, her gaze locked on Ethan. She knew what he had just done. "Stay low," Ethan whispered urgently to Emily. "We need to stay out of their line of sight. Don't make a sound." Emily nodded, her lips trembling, and gently pulled Sophie closer to her. Sophie seemed to understand now that something was wrong. She looked up at her mother, her wide eyes full of confusion. "Mommy? Daddy?" Sophie whispered softly. "We're fine, baby," Emily whispered back, her voice shaking. "Just stay quiet." The second hijacker, still trying to make contact with his team, spun around and locked eyes with Ethan. Ethan's pulse quickened, but he stayed still, praying that the distraction of the alarm and the military jets would keep him from being noticed. Suddenly, the loud sound of a military plane overhead shook the aircraft, rattling the windows. The jets were getting closer. The hijacker's face twisted with rage as he slammed the radio down, cursing under his breath. He rushed toward the cockpit, shouting orders to the first hijacker. "We're losing control. They're here. They know what's happening." Ethan barely had time to react when he heard a voice, this time not over the intercom, but through the wall of the cockpit. "This is Captain Reynolds," came the calm but firm voice. "All passengers, stay in your seats. Help is on the way. We're going to make sure you're safe." The hijackers froze. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The military was on its way, but they still had to deal with the hijackers before anyone could get off the plane. The second hijacker turned back toward the cabin, his eyes searching for anyone who had tried to interfere. He started to move toward Ethan and Emily's row, his gun aimed ahead. The tension in the air was palpable. "Get down, everyone!" the hijacker shouted, his voice wild with panic. "Do as I say, or I'll shoot!" But Ethan didn't flinch. His mind was working quickly, trying to process the unfolding situation. The hijacker was too focused on the cockpit and his own fear of losing control to see Ethan's next move coming. With one quick motion, Ethan reached into his bag, grabbed a small item he had slipped in there earlier, something he had never thought he would use, but now seemed like the only option. A small, personal defense tool. He pulled it out, clicking it open quickly. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to give him the upper hand in this moment. Just as the hijacker took another step toward Ethan, ready to shout another demand, Ethan acted. He lunged forward, pushing the hijacker off balance. The weapon was in his hand in an instant, but before he could make any further move, the hijacker raised his gun. "Don't even think about it!" the hijacker snarled. Ethan's heart pounded as the hijacker's finger twitched near the trigger. But before the man could fire, the door to the cockpit burst open with a force that made everyone in the cabin flinch. Two military personnel rushed into the cabin, weapons drawn. Their movements were swift and practiced, trained for moments exactly like this. "Drop it! Now!" one of the soldiers shouted, his gun trained on the hijacker. The hijacker froze for a split second, and in that moment, Ethan took advantage. He reached for the hijacker's wrist, twisting it sharply. The gun slipped from the man's grip, clattering to the floor. In seconds, the military personnel were on him, subduing the hijacker with ease. "Are you okay, sir?" one of the soldiers asked, looking at Ethan as he caught his breath. Ethan nodded, still trying to process everything. "Yes, I'm fine. But my family—" His voice cracked as he turned to look at Emily and Sophie. The soldier nodded toward Emily, who was holding Sophie tightly. The second soldier moved toward them, checking to make sure they were unharmed. "You're safe now," the soldier said, offering Emily a reassuring smile. Ethan felt a rush of relief wash over him as he finally let himself relax. He looked at Emily and Sophie, both of them still shaken, but alive. They were going to be okay. Outside, the sound of fighter jets roared past the windows, a final sign that help had arrived. Ethan could hear the calm voices of the air traffic controllers over the intercom, guiding the plane down for a safe emergency landing. But as he looked at his family, he knew that their lives would never be the same. The military had arrived just in time, but there was more to this story than anyone realized. Ethan knew Mercer wasn't finished with him, not by a long shot. The man who had orchestrated this hijacking wasn't just after him, he was after something bigger, something that Ethan hadn't fully understood yet. But for now, he could breathe. His family was safe, and the nightmare was over. For the moment. The military personnel moved quickly and efficiently, securing the remaining hijackers and making sure the rest of the passengers were unharmed. Ethan could hear the controlled chaos outside as the emergency landing was set in motion. The relief in the air was palpable. Passengers who had once been frozen in fear were now slowly exhaling, some even talking quietly among themselves. Emily, holding Sophie tightly in her arms, sat beside Ethan, her face pale but relieved. Ethan glanced around the cabin, his eyes still scanning for any signs of danger. The worst of the storm had passed, but something in the back of his mind still told him that this was far from over. As the plane began its descent, the military personnel made their rounds, double-checking the cabin and ensuring that no one else posed a threat. Ethan's body was sore, his ribs aching from where he had been thrown to the ground during the hijacking. But the pain in his body was nothing compared to the unease in his stomach. He could still hear the hijacker's words echoing in his mind. "You've been chosen." What did that mean? Why had they targeted him? Sophie, still curled up against Emily, was finally starting to calm down. The sound of her soft, steady breathing was a small comfort to Ethan, who was still trying to make sense of everything. He had only just begun to process the nightmare they had just endured when a voice broke through the tension in the cabin. "Mr. Carter?" The voice was firm, but not unfriendly. Ethan looked up, his heart sinking as he saw a tall man in a dark suit standing in the aisle. He didn't recognize the man, but the way he carried himself made it clear that this was someone important. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, his voice still shaky but filled with a sense of caution. "My name is Agent Carter," the man said, his voice measured. "I'm with the Department of Homeland Security. I need to speak with you." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Homeland Security?" he repeated, glancing at Emily, who looked just as confused as he felt. The agent nodded, taking a step closer. "Yes, I'm afraid we need to have a conversation. We've been monitoring the situation from the ground, and we need your cooperation." "Cooperation?" Ethan echoed, his frustration rising. "What do you mean? I've been through enough today. I just want to get off this plane with my family and forget this whole mess ever happened." "I understand, sir," Agent Carter said calmly, "but I assure you, this isn't over. We've been tracking the hijackers, But there's something much larger going on here. We need to get a statement from you." Ethan stared at the agent, his mind racing. The hijacking was over. They were safe now. So why were they still dragging him into this? Hadn't he been through enough? But before he could voice any more concerns, Agent Carter spoke again, his tone more serious. "Mr. Carter, the hijacking was only a small part of something much bigger. We have reason to believe that Daniel Mercer is behind this, and your name is connected to him. You've been flagged as part of an investigation we've been running." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Mercer? That name sent a chill down his spine. He had never suspected that the man he had once worked with, a seemingly harmless business contact, was capable of something like this. "Mercer," Ethan repeated, his voice hoarse. "How is that even possible? I haven't seen him in years. He was just a contact from a failed business deal." Agent Carter didn't seem surprised by Ethan's reaction. "I understand. But someone used your name. Someone close to you is involved in something much more dangerous than you can imagine. And we need you to help us track down the people behind this." Ethan shook his head, his hands clenching into fists. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not involved in anything illegal. I'm just a regular guy trying to get by." "I believe you," Agent Carter said, his expression softening slightly. "But the evidence is there. Your name was flagged, and we've been trying to connect the dots. The hijackers didn't just pick you at random. They were after something specific, something connected to you. And Mercer's involvement is no coincidence." Ethan felt the weight of the agent's words pressing down on him. Mercer. His mind raced through the years, remembering the business meetings, the awkward exchanges, and the way things had fallen apart. But nothing about Mercer ever seemed sinister. He had been just another businessman trying to make a deal. But now it was clear. Something was off. His name had been used, and somehow it had led him to the center of a web of crime, terrorism, and deceit. "How do you know Mercer's behind this?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've been tracking him for years," Agent Carter replied. "He's involved in multiple smuggling operations, drugs, weapons, even human trafficking. He's a ghost in the system, but every now and then his name pops up in the wrong places, like yours." Ethan felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He wanted to deny everything, to tell the agent that they had made a mistake, that this was all just some horrible misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Mercer was using him. Sophie, sensing the shift in her father's mood, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Daddy? What's going on? Are we going to see Grandma now?" Ethan's heart cracked as he looked at his daughter, her innocent face filled with confusion. He wanted to say yes, to tell her that everything was okay, but the truth was far from that. It wasn't over, and it might never be. Agent Carter's eyes softened as he looked at Ethan. "I know this is hard, Mr. Carter, but you need to understand. You're not just a bystander in this. Someone wants you to stop asking questions. Someone is making sure you don't get close to the truth. And if we don't stop them now, they'll come after you and your family again." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. He wanted to protect his family, to get on that plane to Manila, and forget everything. But it wasn't that simple. Not anymore. "We can't just walk away," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. "Not until I know the truth." Ethan's mind was spinning, the weight of Agent Carter's words pressing down on him. Sophie was safe. Emily was safe. And yet the reality of what had just happened, the hijacking, the military intervention, the connection to Daniel Mercer, was still too much to grasp. Everything had happened so fast, and now, As the plane began its descent, it felt like nothing was certain anymore. They were finally landing, but the journey ahead wasn't over. The danger wasn't behind them. Ethan's thoughts drifted back to the conversation with Agent Carter. Mercer's involved in multiple smuggling operations. Your name came up because of him. He had never imagined that a simple business deal from years ago could have escalated into something this dangerous. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. If someone had used his name, someone close to him, that meant he was part of something far bigger than he could understand. "We're almost there," Emily whispered softly, breaking Ethan's train of thought. She had been quiet since the agent had left, clearly processing everything herself. Ethan turned to her, his expression still clouded with concern. "I can't just let it go, Em," he said quietly. "I've been dragged into something, and I don't know how deep it goes, but I can't walk away from it. Not until I know the truth." Emily met his eyes, her own filled with a mix of exhaustion and fear. "I know you want to protect us, Ethan, but what if you're putting us in more danger by getting involved in all this?" Ethan looked down at his hands, clenched into fists on his lap. He understood her fear. She wanted to keep Sophie safe, and right now, it seemed like the safest thing was to walk away, to get on that flight to Manila and never look back. But Ethan knew that if he ignored this, if he allowed someone else to control the narrative, it wouldn't just be his life in danger. It would be Emily's and Sophie's too. He had seen the fear in those hijackers' eyes when the military jets arrived. The plan wasn't just about money. It was about something personal. And Mercer, whoever he was the key to it all. "Em, I'm not doing this for me," Ethan said, his voice low but determined. "I'm doing it for you, for Sophie. I can't let someone like Mercer keep playing this game with people's lives." Emily's eyes softened, but there was still doubt there. "And what if you get hurt? What if they come after us again? I don't want to lose you." Ethan reached out and gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek. "You won't lose me, I promise. But I can't live with myself if I walk away from this without knowing why Mercer is doing this. I need to stop him." She exhaled slowly, her eyes closing for a brief moment as she processed what Ethan was saying. "I don't like it," she murmured, "but if this is something you have to do, I'll stand by you." Sophie, sensing the tension in the air, looked up at them. "Daddy? Mommy? Are we going to see Grandma now?" Ethan smiled at her, trying to ease her worries, though the unease in his chest remained. "Yes, sweetheart. We'll see Grandma soon, but we need to make sure everything is okay before we go." Emily squeezed Ethan's hand, silently agreeing. They had made it this far, and whatever came next, they would face it together. As the plane touched down, the roar of the engines settled into a dull hum. The emergency lights blinked off, and the cabin slowly began to return to normal. But Ethan's mind was still racing. He could feel the pull of the unknown ahead. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his family's safety, and his gut told him that Mercer wouldn't just let them walk away. The plane taxied to the gate, and Ethan felt the weight of what was about to happen. The moment they stepped off this plane, everything would change. They were going to have to deal with this, whether they wanted to or not. But the alternative, walking away, pretending like nothing happened, was not an option. A few minutes later, the door to the plane opened. Ethan, Emily, and Sophie stood up, gathered their things, and walked toward the exit. But Ethan's heart was heavy. As they stepped out into the jet bridge, a figure appeared at the end of the walkway. He was wearing a dark suit, his face expressionless, but Ethan could sense the authority in his posture. "Mr. Carter," the man said as he approached, his voice low but firm. "We need to speak." Ethan's heart sank. He had hoped to just leave, to walk away from this mess, but there was no escaping it. Not now. Emily's hand tightened around Ethan's, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who is this?" "I'm Agent Lewis with the FBI," the man replied, flashing a badge before continuing. "And we need to talk about your connection to Daniel Mercer. We believe you can help us take him down." Ethan's eyes locked onto Agent Lewis, the weight of the situation finally hitting him. He had no choice now. Mercer wasn't going to go away, and neither was the danger that followed him. The plane door closed behind them as Ethan turned to face the agent. "I'm listening," he said, his voice steady but full of resolve. Ethan's stomach tightened as he followed Agent Lewis down the hallway. The weight of the situation had never felt heavier. The plane had barely touched down, but already the government was pulling him back into a dangerous game he didn't choose to play. Mercer's name was like a shadow now, hovering over everything Ethan had worked for, everything he had hoped for. His family was here, in the middle of this chaos, and Ethan knew they couldn't escape it by simply walking away. Emily, Sophie, and Ethan walked briskly behind Agent Lewis, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The world outside the airport was chaotic with sirens, flashing lights, and the constant hum of military presence. But inside, it felt eerily quiet. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, his voice low but steady. Agent Lewis didn't look back, but his answer came with a calm authority. "To a secure location. We need to discuss Mercer and your connection to him." Ethan's mind raced. Every step they took seemed to pull him deeper into a web of lies and deceit. He had always thought of himself as a simple man, a software developer, a father, a husband. But now, he was trapped in something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. They reached a secure room at the end of the hall, and Agent Lewis motioned for them to enter. Ethan stepped inside, but his attention was divided between Emily, who had a tight grip on Sophie's hand, and the agent who was already sitting at the table. "We've been tracking Mercer for years," Agent Lewis began as soon as the door clicked shut behind them. "He's not just a smuggler or a criminal. He's part of something much bigger, an international network that's been operating under the radar for a long time." Ethan swallowed hard. "How does this involve me?" Lewis leaned back, crossing his arms. "Your name came up as someone who could potentially disrupt Mercer's plans. We believe someone close to you used your identity, either knowingly or unknowingly, to gain access to Mercer's operations." Ethan's mind raced again. "What does that mean? Who would do that? And why would they target me?" "I don't have all the details yet," Agent Lewis said, his voice tinged with frustration. "But we suspect it's someone from your past. Someone you might have worked with, or even trusted. A ghost from your life." Ethan's stomach lurched. His thoughts immediately went back to Mercer. Had the man planted something on him all those years ago? Had he been part of something larger and never even known it? Agent Lewis noticed the change in Ethan's expression and pressed further. "We know Mercer is trying to get you involved. He's not letting you walk away that easily. We can't risk him coming after your family again, especially now that he knows we're onto him. We need your help, Carter." Ethan clenched his jaw. The walls felt like they were closing in around him. "What do you want from me?" "You're the key to bringing Mercer down," Lewis said, his eyes locking onto Ethan's. "We have one chance. You've already been flagged by the system. Your name is tied to a smuggling network, and it won't be long before Mercer realizes you're still a threat. We need you to help us get the information we need to bring him in." Ethan's eyes flickered to Emily. She was watching him, her expression torn between worry and the quiet understanding of the decision he would have to make. The agent's words hung in the air. Ethan was caught between a desire to protect his family and a need to understand the bigger picture. Mercer had been pulling strings all along, and now Ethan was in the middle of a game he didn't even know he was playing. "I didn't ask for any of this," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't sign up to be a pawn in this man's game. I'm just trying to protect my family." Lewis nodded, his face serious. "I understand. But you're already part of this, whether you like it or not. The question is, what are you willing to do to make sure Mercer doesn't destroy everything you love?" Ethan's breath caught. He looked at Emily, her eyes filled with quiet concern, and then at Sophie, who was playing with her stuffed bear in the corner of the room. For a moment, Ethan felt torn. But then, a wave of clarity washed over him. He couldn't run from this. He couldn't live in fear, always wondering when Mercer would strike again. He turned to Agent Lewis. "What do you need me to do?" Lewis's face softened, and he sat up a little straighter. "We need you to help us access Mercer's financial networks, track his movements, and get us the evidence we need to bring him down for good." Ethan's heart raced, but he knew what he had to do. The world of cybercrime, smuggling, and dirty deals might have been a foreign territory, but for his family's safety, he couldn't back down now. "I'll do it," Ethan said firmly, his voice steady. "But we need to keep my family safe. I won't risk them again." "Understood," Agent Lewis replied, nodding in agreement. "We'll make sure they're protected. We can't let Mercer get to you again." Ethan turned to Emily and Sophie. "This is it, Em. We're in this together. I'm not letting them get away with this." Emily nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Just promise me you'll come back." "I will," Ethan said, his voice filled with a quiet but determined resolve. "I'll finish this, and then we'll be free." I promise Ethan knew the battle was just beginning. Mercer wasn't going to go down easily. But now, for the first time, Ethan felt like he had the upper hand. It was time to take control of his own fate, and to stop the man who had turned his life upside down. As he stood there, facing the reality of what was to come, Ethan knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice, and he would fight for it, no matter the cost.